You think you are thinking, but most of what you experience as thinking is not active at all. It is repetition. There is a pattern running in your mind, a loop, and it operates quietly enough that you mistake it for awareness. It feels deliberate. It feels like you are engaging with something meaningful. But what is actually happening is far more mechanical than that. You revisit the same ideas, the same concerns, the same imagined scenarios, not because they need solving, but because your mind has learned to return to them. The brain is not primarily concerned with truth. It is concerned with efficiency. And efficiency is built through repetition. Every time a thought is repeated, the pathway that produces it becomes easier to activate. Not because the thought is correct, but because it is familiar. And familiarity is interpreted by the brain as something safe. This is where the structure begins to form. A thought appears. It triggers a response. That response reinforces the thought, and the cycle begins to stabilize. At first, this happens slowly. You still feel like you are choosing what to think. You still feel like you are analyzing. But gradually, the sequence compresses. The thought arrives faster. The response becomes immediate. The distinction between thinking and reacting begins to disappear. Eventually, you stop noticing the process entirely. You assume that because a thought is present, it must be relevant. But presence is not evidence. A thought can appear frequently and still be inaccurate. It can feel urgent and still be unnecessary. It can feel meaningful and still be nothing more than a well-rehearsed pattern. The loop does not evaluate the content of the thought. It only reinforces the fact that it has appeared again. And that is enough. Over time, repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates priority, and priority creates identity. You do not just think the thought, you begin to believe that it reflects something real about you, something stable, something true. At that point, the loop is no longer something you experience. It becomes something you live inside. And once you are inside it, it becomes extremely difficult to recognize because it does not feel like a pattern. It feels like reality. The thought appears instantly without construction, without effort, as if it has always been there. Because in a sense, it has. The brain is not generating something new. It is retrieving something known, fully formed, with the same emotional weight, the same tone, the same conclusion. This is not problem solving. This is recall. You are not progressing toward a solution. You are returning to a familiar state. And the more often you return, the more natural that state begins to feel. This is how the loop becomes self-sustaining. Not because it is correct, but because it is consistent. Consistency creates expectation. Expectation shapes perception. And perception begins to filter reality before you are even aware of it. You do not encounter situations directly anymore. You encounter them through the lens of what has already been repeated. This is where distortion begins. The present moment is no longer experienced as it is. It is interpreted, filtered through memory, filtered through anticipation, filtered through patterns that were built long before this moment ever arrived. And because those patterns feel familiar, they feel accurate, even when they are not. This is how the loop gains control, not by forcing you into specific thoughts, but by limiting what you are able to perceive as possible. It narrows the range of interpretation. It reduces complexity into something predictable. And predictability to the brain feels safe, even when it produces discomfort, even when it produces anxiety, even when it produces doubt. Because the brain does not prioritize well-being in the way you might expect. It prioritizes stability, and stability comes from repetition. This is why people can remain inside patterns that clearly do not serve them. Not because they are unaware of the discomfort, but because the pattern itself feels known. And what is known feels manageable, even when it is restrictive. This is where attention becomes central to the entire process. Whatever you return your attention to repeatedly becomes easier to access, not because you are choosing it consciously, but because you are reinforcing it neurologically. Attention is not neutral. It is directional. It shapes what becomes dominant in your mind. And over time, what becomes dominant begins to feel like your default. This is why the loop feels automatic. It is not because you lack control. It is because the pathway has been repeated enough times that it no longer requires effort. It has become the path of least resistance, and the brain will always follow the path of least resistance unless something interrupts it. This is where most people misunderstand what is happening. They believe the problem is the thought itself, so they try to remove it, suppress it, replace it, distract themselves from it. But this approach fails to recognize what is actually maintaining the loop. It is not the presence of the thought, it is the engagement with it. The moment you engage with the thought, you are reinforcing it. It does not matter whether that engagement is positive or negative. Agreement strengthens it, resistance strengthens it, analysis strengthens it. Any form of continued attention strengthens it, because the brain does not differentiate between types of engagement. It only registers repetition. So the more you try to fix the thought, the more you signal that it matters, and the more it matters, the more it returns. This is why the loop can feel impossible to escape, because even the attempt to escape becomes part of the loop. You are still returning to the same material, still processing the same structure, still reinforcing the same pathway. This creates a system that appears active, but produces no real change. It feels like movement, but it is circular. You are not moving forward. You are moving within a closed structure. And within that structure, everything leads back to the same point, the same thought, the same conclusion, the same emotional response. Over and over again. This is where fatigue begins to appear. Not physical fatigue, but cognitive fatigue. The kind that comes from repeated processing without resolution. The brain is expending energy, but not producing anything new. And that mismatch creates exhaustion, because effort is being applied, but nothing is changing. This is why overthinking feels draining. Not because thinking itself is difficult, but because the system is closed. There is no endpoint, only continuation. And continuation without resolution creates strain, because the brain is not designed to stay in unresolved cycles indefinitely. But the loop overrides that. It keeps returning, keeps reactivating, keeps replaying, until it becomes the dominant mode of operation. At that point, it no longer feels like something you are doing. It feels like something you are. And that is where it becomes most limiting. Because when a pattern becomes part of your identity, you stop questioning it. You stop observing it. You accept it, even when it is reducing your ability to respond to the world clearly, even when it is narrowing your perception, even when it is creating unnecessary tension. Because it feels like you, and what feels like you is rarely challenged. This is why awareness alone is not enough. You can recognize the loop, you can even describe it, but still remain inside it, because recognition is not the same as separation. You can understand the pattern intellectually, while still being pulled into it automatically. And this creates a second layer of frustration, because now you can see what is happening, but you are still experiencing it, still returning to it, still following it. This is where the real shift needs to occur. Not in what you think, but in how you relate to what appears in your mind. The shift begins when you stop treating thoughts as something you have to follow, not something you have to solve, not something you have to engage with, but something that appears. This distinction is small, but it changes everything. Because as long as a thought feels like something that demands your participation, you will continue to return to it automatically. But when it becomes something you can observe without immediately reacting, the structure of the loop begins to weaken. This is where separation begins. Not by pushing the thought away, not by trying to control it, but by recognizing it as something that is happening, rather than something that is you. Most people never make this distinction. They assume that because a thought appears in their mind, it must be relevant, it must be meaningful, it must require attention. But this is not true. A thought can appear simply because it has appeared before. Nothing more. And when you begin to see that clearly, you stop assigning automatic importance to everything that arises. This creates space. At first, that space is brief, almost unnoticeable. A thought appears, and instead of immediately following it, there is a pause, not forced, not dramatic, just a moment of recognition. This again, and in that moment, the loop is interrupted. Not completely, but enough. Because the loop depends on continuity. It depends on you moving from thought to reaction without interruption. The moment that chain is broken, even briefly, the system begins to lose stability. This is where control actually exists. Not in stopping thoughts from appearing, but in not automatically continuing them. This is a different kind of control. It is not forceful. It is not aggressive. It is precise. You are not trying to remove the loop. You are allowing it to exist without feeding it. And what is not fed weakens. This is where attention becomes a tool rather than a reaction. Instead of being pulled into the thought, you begin to notice where your attention is going. And that awareness gives you a choice, a small one, but a real one. Do you continue this pattern, or do you let it end here? At first, the answer will not always be consistent. You will still be pulled back into the loop, still find yourself following the same thoughts, still reacting in familiar ways. But something has changed. You are no longer completely inside it. You are beginning to see it. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot maintain the same level of control because it is no longer invisible. This is where the loop begins to lose its authority, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer convincing. It still appears, but it feels different, less urgent, less dominant, less real, because you recognize it for what it is, a pattern, not a truth. And that distinction changes your entire relationship to it. You stop trying to solve every thought. You stop trying to control every outcome. You stop treating every mental event as something that requires action. And in that absence of constant engagement, the system begins to shift. The repetition slows. The intensity decreases. The space between thought and reaction expands. And within that space, something else becomes available. Clarity. Not the kind that comes from analyzing everything, but the kind that comes from not being pulled into everything. Because clarity is not created through more thinking. It is revealed when unnecessary thinking stops. This is where the loop finally begins to dissolve. Not suddenly and not completely, but gradually. Because it is no longer being reinforced, no longer being followed, no longer being mistaken for something it is not. And in its place, there is something simpler, a quieter mind, not empty, but no longer crowded with repetition, no longer dominated by familiar patterns, no longer reacting automatically to everything that appears. And from that position, your relationship to yourself changes. You begin to trust your perception again. Not because you have eliminated uncertainty, but because you are no longer overwhelmed by it. You begin to respond instead of react, to see instead of assume, to move forward instead of circle. And that is where real control begins. Not control over every thought, but control over your participation in them. Because once you are no longer automatically involved in every pattern that appears, those patterns lose their ability to direct you. They still exist, but they no longer define your experience. And that is the difference between being controlled by your mind and understanding how it works. If you are working to understand your mind at a deeper level and step out of patterns that no longer serve you, consider subscribing to the Mind Refined. Because most people are not aware of the loops they are trapped in, and the moment you begin to see them clearly, you begin to step outside of them.